In this video, I'd like to celebrate the life of Michael Basman, who sadly died last weekend at the age of 76. He was a legend on the English chess scene. That's no exaggeration. He was truly one of a kind on and off the board. He had a real twinkle in his eye and a gentle sense of humour. He was very self-deprecating. And he delighted in the absurd. He was an optimist. He always wanted to improve life, and he believed he could improve life for everyone. He had crazy ideas, both on and off the chessboard, but sometimes those ideas came off. And perhaps his greatest achievement was setting up the UK Chess Challenge, which was a tournament for children that was a national tournament, and each year around about 70,000 school children took part in this, with tournaments all over the country. And it's reckoned that around 1 million kids played in this tournament over the years. Above all, he was a kind man. I knew Mike for practically all of my chess life, and I can say that, after speaking to him, I always came away with a smile on my face. He was just great company. I played against him quite a few times. From memory, always pretty mad games. I remember once we were playing in a weekend tournament. And the pieces were flying, crazy time scramble, and in the middle of it, I gave a check, and he played some random move, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether I could take his king, or I didn't know what the protocol was. So I pointed out that he was in check and I could take his king, and without missing a beat, he replied, "I'm glad you told me that." And, he had incredible charm, and the position was reset. The game careered on, and I'm pretty sure he finally beat me in that one. Yeah, he had real charm. He played so many brilliant games. It's very hard to pick one, but I'd like to show you his immortal waiting game against Ulf Andersson, another legend, and a legend in a different way on the chessboard, with rather different styles. And this was played in the traditional Hastings tournament, in the 1974-1975 tournament. So it was played on the 9th of January 1975. It is sensational, it really is. So Ulf Andersson with white. And b6 from Bassman. He did like to fianchetto his queen's bishop, often with a6 and b5, but in this game he plays b6. In fact, the opening in this game is relatively orthodox. It transposes into a Queen's Indian, but it's actually the middle game play from Mike that is really extraordinary. So yeah, we've got a pretty normal Queen's Indian on the board. But it's around about here that Mike starts to go his own way. So h6, well, okay, that's already a little unorthodox. And a6, it's these moves, these little pawn moves at the side of the board that I'm always wagging my finger at my students if they make these pawn moves. But watch what happens. Rook c1. Already this is an unpleasant position for black, actually. Normally in the Queen's Indian, you want to get in c5 to, try and attack white's centre. But, here this is really impossible. After this exchange and then queen b3, you can see there's so much pressure on black's position already. And something like this, well, this is going to win this pawn pretty swiftly. Horrible position for black. But Mike realises this, and he plays rook a7. So this is really the start of the weirdness. Protecting the bishop. So given half a chance, I'm sure he would like to exchange pawns here and then exchange these bishops. And the rook protects this pawn. And, well, black has freed his game to a certain extent. So Andersson just takes on d5. And now pawn takes pawn. I mean, again, exchanging pieces with knight takes was possible, but this is a little bit unusual, taking with the pawn. It's already a very difficult position for black. Black is just so passive here. It's very hard to find a really active continuation when there's so much pressure on d5, pressure on the c file. And I'm sure Andersson was thinking, yep, things are pretty good. It's very hard to bring this knight into the game because this pawn is hanging, and yeah, you've got to watch out for this one as well. Bishop a8. So a curious shuffle, but the rook does defend the c-pawn. Rook fd1. So this really makes sure that c5 is never going to happen because there's just so much pressure on that pawn. And yes, knight d7, you just can't develop this knight because of knight takes pawn. So here is where Mike starts his waiting game. His masterly inactivity, as this was described afterwards, I think by John Spielman actually. h3. I mean, black has at least staked a claim in the centre, but now he just decides to wait. And actually, he's absolutely right to do so, because any activity from black will just be cut down by white. So Mike starts this policy of simply sitting there on the position, shuffling with the king. And Andersson builds up nicely. And now a shuffle with the bishop. Essentially, he's decided he's going to do absolutely nothing. And Andersson is allowed to make all these little improving moves. But at some point, white has to decide what to do. f4, right. So this is the decision. Andersson has prepared everything and he decides to advance on the king side. But Bassman continues his shuffling. Queen d6. Well, with the queen in the same line as the bishop, then that tempts this pawn forward to open up the diagonal, but the queen just comes straight back again. So you could say that, or has Bassman achieved something by tempting this pawn forward? It does mean that white's king is a little bit exposed, but surely this gain of space from white must result in something, and it does enable white to attack on the king side. There's even a nice hook there. But the waiting game continues. Bishop b7, rook g1. Uh-oh, this looks a bit scary for the king. c6. So that protects this pawn. Now, it does weaken this one a little bit, but you never know. The rook might be able to come into play on the 7th rank. Bishop f3. This is looking really ominous for black. That one needs stopping. So g5 is stopped in its tracks. And here the rook comes back to c1. I mean, knight a4 looks like a very tempting move to attack this one, which inevitably will force the pawn forward. I mean, white, I think, has gained something here, because exchanging, well, I think getting rid of that dark squared bishop must be nice for white. But I mean, maybe Andersson didn't like this. He thought perhaps this bishop can come back and this knight will have to drop back. Who knows? And another way of playing is to advance on the queen side and maybe drop this bishop and exchange off this knight. So it's not altogether clear, but it feels like, knight a4 it's the kind of thing you want to do. But Andersson just held the position. You know, he's used to these kind of positions where you wait for a long time and you build up slowly. Bishop d6. This is a nice maneuver, with the bishop on the same diagonal as this bishop and the king. Knight a4, and now the bishop has time to drop back to protect this pawn, so black doesn't need to commit. Then again, both these pawns look a bit vulnerable. King g3. So the king protects this square, preventing the queen from coming up to h4. Knight f6. So with the king on the g file, then probably g5 isn't going to happen. Well, not for the moment. h4. I mean, this is quite scary. Knight d7. So things are starting to happen. Andersson is committing his pawns on the king side, which of course is double-edged, because if black ever breaks through, then the king would be left without cover. But this knight has finally come back to put some pressure on this one. And this is quite a big moment in the game, because it feels as though, you know, white has made progress, but you know, you still need to make a breakthrough. But what do you do about this knight in the middle? Well, Andersson decides to exchange off. But perhaps he should have just supported this knight. But now it can get really tricky, because if white is going to make a break, then the whole position starts to blow up. And I suspect it's not really how Andersson wanted to play the game. He wanted to keep things under control. So he exchanged and then played rook e2. You know, I think he's imagining some kind of, you know, middle game grind where he manages to exploit the weaknesses on the queen side. Rook e8. Of course, a sensible move on the semi-open file. But it's not going to be easy for white to keep things under control with the kingside pawns advanced and the king advanced as well. King h3. Bishop takes bishop. And then an exchange of rooks. Well, Mike has definitely achieved something here. By exchanging pieces, there's less congestion in black's camp, and that pawn is a bit weaker. This pawn is potentially a bit weak. There could be something going on the e file. Queen e7, attacking the bishop. Bishop f3, defending. b5, and now it's time for black to break out. The knight hops in. Could exchange straight away, but bishop c8. So this bishop, finds a very nice square on the back rank, but looking at the king, this is tricky. And I suspect time pressure was involved here. Andersson switched the queen over to bolster that pawn on f5, but maybe h5 would have been more circumspect. But I suspect Andersson still harboured ambitions to push forward here. But this is definitely a mistake, because now it was black's moment to strike. Mike played h5. And this undermines the support for the pawn on f5. Pawn takes pawn. So you can see this is now very tricky for white. Queen f6, building up pressure. King g3. It's tricky for white now, really tricky. Bishop f5. I mean, it's quite clear that the game has turned completely. Material is still level, pawns still even, but look at white's pawns. I can imagine Andersson wouldn't have enjoyed that. He has, of course, a very sensitive positional understanding, and this is now very difficult for white. The rook drops back. So it didn't come into play on the 7th rank. It's just going to switch back on the 8th rank. And it gets to the e file before this rook. That is very important. Queen's d3. And now, again, Bassman breaks out here. c5. I mean, actually, there are other ways to go. You could play queen f5 instead, but c5, and this works perfectly. In fact, white should take this, but black certainly has the initiative. But you know, this is a tricky position now. But Andersson took on c5 with the queen, and now queen f5, and this really is incredibly powerful. Threatening to bring the queen in here. Queen takes pawn, check, and now this attack is absolutely decisive. I'm afraid with no pawn cover, then black's pieces just flood in. And this attack is decisive. And this one is just going. It really, yeah, it's absolutely over at this point. Just a sensational game from Mike. Who would have the guts to just shuffle back and forth in this position with the king? King h7, back to g8, and then later on bishop a8, back to b7. This requires enormous self-confidence. But it was absolutely the right thing to do, because if black presses forward, white would just pounce. Just a sensational game. I hope to show you more games from Mike Basman, actually, because he really was one of a kind. Hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching.